Okay, let's start with a quick fact check. The Great Reset is not a conspiracy theory. According to Wikipedia, the Great Reset is a, quote, economic recovery plan for the post-pandemic world put together by the World Economic Forum, or WEF. And this plan is based on a 2020 book, which is of course titled The Great Reset. For those unfamiliar, the WEF is a Swiss organization made up of some of the most powerful individuals and institutions in the world, including current and former presidents, media moguls, big tech CEOs, asset managers, banks, and non-governmental organizations. As per the WEF's own website, the organization's explicit purpose is to, quote, shape global, regional, and industry agendas, and the WEF does this by supporting individuals and institutions that promote its agenda. The WEF is headed by the one and only Klaus Schwab, a German engineer, economist, and former professor who has served as its chairman since it was founded in 1971. Naturally, almost all the WEF's agendas are based on Klaus's ideas. This includes The Great Reset, as it was Klaus who co-authored the book The Great Reset, along with another lifelong academic and economist named Thierry Melleret. Just a few days after the book was published, the WEF hosted a virtual event about what The Great Reset will look like, which featured Klaus, Thierry, and a couple of other WEF insiders. So, for starters, Klaus & co. consider the pandemic to be on a par with another world war as far as its global disruption goes, and this presents an opportunity to replace capitalism with stakeholder capitalism. As you might have guessed, stakeholder capitalism is another one of Klaus's ideas, and the short of it is that it replaces shareholders with so-called stakeholders, who basically decide what everyone does. If you're wondering who the stakeholders are, Klaus has made it clear in many interviews and at many events that the stakeholders are the individuals and institutions who are a part of the WEF. In crypto terms, you can think of stakeholder capitalism as being the total centralization of control in the hands of the world's most powerful people, corporations, and organizations. According to Klaus, there are 3 phases to the Great Reset, and the first 2 relate to the pandemic. These are restrain, i.e. fight the virus, which is the phase we're currently in, and recover, which is the next phase where the world enters the, quote, new normal. That's another phrase you've doubtless been hearing a lot these days, and what's interesting is that the term new normal seems to have been coined by Chinese President Xi Jinping during his 2017 speech at the World Economic Forum's Davos meeting. Probably nothing. Now, the third and final phase is the Great Reset itself, which focuses on the following 5 points: redefining the social contract, decarbonizing the economy, digitizing everything, implementing stakeholder capitalism, and making sure those first 4 tenets find their way into every country. As to how exactly the WEF will roll out the Great Reset around the world, Klaus explicitly states that this will be achieved primarily with the help of the WEF's network of so-called global shapers and the WEF's network of so-called young global leaders, who will all push for the Great Reset in their respective nations. And, of course, the WEF hopes to have all its ducks in a row by 2030, which is a date we've been seeing mentioned a lot these days. Total coincidence, I assure you. Now, believe it or not, but this is just the tip of the iceberg of all the insane stuff that was said at that virtual event, and I'll leave a link to the video in the description so you can hear it straight from the horses' mouths. The more you watch these folks, the more you'll realize that no conspiracy theories are required, because they'll often tell you exactly what they want and how they plan on getting it if you just take the time to listen. Nowhere is this truer than at the World Economic Forum's aforementioned Davos meetings, and you can find out what was said about cryptocurrency at this year's meeting using the link in the description. So, now that we know what the Great Reset is and how the WEF elites plan on rolling it out, we can prepare for its 5 points, which you'll recall are redefining the social contract, decarbonizing the economy, digitizing everything, implementing stakeholder capitalism, and doing all of the above in every country. Now, I'll start by saying that there seems to be quite a bit of overlap between these 5 points, and it sounds like they're going to be implemented simultaneously, not in sequential order. It's also important to remember that these points are slowly being implemented as you watch this video. This means you need to keep in mind how a change in one could affect the other 4 when preparing to avoid or resist them. Note that this could become difficult to do, since part of the WEF's agenda involves distorting traditional definitions of things like inflation, well-being, and economic growth. This distortion of definitions lies at the core of redefining the social contract, as this involves replacing all of the above with ESG-focused metrics that will prioritize, say, diversity and inclusion over actual productivity. If you watched our video about ESG, you'll know that it has its roots in an initiative spearheaded by the United Nations and some of the world's largest corporations, and that as time goes on, ESG criteria are becoming more aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Now, there are 17 SGDs in total, and I'll give you a couple of examples of what the WEF wants to see from a few of them, as per comments made by WEF insiders at that Great Reset virtual event I touched on earlier. So, the 4th SDG is quality education, and Great Reset co-author Thierry Malloret mentioned that the WEF doesn't like that, say, a science degree from one university is considered to be more prestigious than a science degree from another university. As such, the WEF would like to see all degrees eliminated and replaced with specific skills training that would last until the end of your life. In other words, you're going to be in school until you die and you'll never even get a degree. Never mind the WEF indoctrination you're likely to endure. Now, the switch to skills training also not so subtly implies that there will be no more small businesses or entrepreneurs, just mega corporations where everyone is a worker bee. Now, this sounds ridiculous until you realize that it relates to the 10th SDG, which is reduced inequality. Here, the WEF is willing to do just about whatever it takes to ensure that economic inequalities do not continue to increase. This includes making sure that you'll own nothing and be happy, like the WEF's infamous Twitter video said. Instead, you'll rent what you use from the stakeholders who will own everything. Recall that these stakeholders are all the folks at the WEF. Now, as history has shown, attempts at making everyone equal tend to end very badly, as making everyone equal usually translates to making everyone, bar a select few, equally poor and miserable, and the select few people in power are subsequently forced to kill anyone who tries to reject that poverty and misery. Ironically enough, the WEF's push for eliminating inequality comes from the fears its constituents have about the riots, revolutions, and migrations that will inevitably occur if inequality continues to increase. This has been admitted by a few WEF members on stage, including at that Great Reset virtual event. Now, luckily, there's an easy way to resist this redefining of social contracts, and that's to reject any ESG or SDG-related criteria, especially when it's being used to redefine, say, what a recession means. Instead, stick to tried and true social contracts and reinforce them with your friends, family, and community. Better yet, invest your time, money, and energy in individuals and institutions who vocally oppose ESG, SDG, and other top-down diktats coming from technocrats who are out of touch with what life is like for the average person. Pro tip: stay away from any companies that force you to pay a subscription service to use a physical product that should be entirely in your ownership the moment you purchase it. Your future might just depend on it. Speaking of your future, the second point of focus for the Great Reset is decarbonising the economy, and here's where things get a bit complicated and a bit contentious. That's because many would argue that moving away from fossil fuels is a good thing, including me. However, there is a right way and a wrong way to transition to more renewable energy sources. So, telling farmers to stop using fertilizer during a food crisis or shutting down nuclear plants during an energy shortage is not how you decarbonize the economy. It's how you destroy the economy. It's also important to remember that many environmental elites see the average person as a form of carbon that should be reduced, if not eliminated, which is why they're eager to implement lifestyles and diets that are objectively unhealthy, such as living in the metaverse 24/7 and eating bugs. Now, another problem with the WEF's green energy agenda is that the energy structures it envisions will result in the hyper-centralization of the electricity grid, and that's probably by design. That's because if everything is running on electricity, it becomes pretty easy to control, well, everything. Another thing that's probably by design is the focus on wind and solar, and that's because not every country has the ability or resources to create its own wind farms or solar panels. This forces them to trade with other countries for energy, which promotes the globalized world the WEF wants to see. Fun fact, the largest manufacturer of solar panels is China. Food for thought. Now, as with the redefining of social contracts, there's an easy way to resist the WEF's warped decarbonisation doctrine, and that's to advocate for renewable energy solutions that actually make sense, and educate your friends, family and community about the risks of decarbonising too quickly. Better yet, try and become as energy independent as you can by acquiring things like solar panels and power generators and learning how to build good gasifiers. That last bit will come in handy when they start making it more and more difficult for the average person to buy petrol and petrol-powered cars. Pro tip, consider getting your hands on the same kind of car that's used by emergency services like the police in your area. Chances are they won't be switching to electric anytime soon, and the commonality of the car means it will be cheap and easy to fix for the foreseeable future. And if you're wondering, no, Bitcoin will not be banned because of its energy use or carbon emissions. That's because even the WEF knows that the energy and carbon emissions associated with crypto mining are a fraction of a percentage of the global total. They're just upset that they can't control BTC like other cryptos, which is why ESG-obsessed asset managers are pushing for green energy disclosures from crypto miners and investing in publicly traded crypto mining companies. It's their attempt at taking control, and it will fail. Now, if you want the facts about Bitcoin's energy use and carbon emissions, you can check out our video about CoinShares' crypto mining report using the link in the description. Now, Bitcoin actually relates to the third focus of the Great Reset, and that's the digitization of everything, and I mean everything. If you watched our video about the Bank for International Settlements' vision of the future of the financial system, you'll know that it wants essentially every asset in existence to be tokenized on a permissioned blockchain that's run by the government and the central bank. To clarify, yes, the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, is heavily involved with the WEF, and many of its members are so-called agenda contributors, meaning they're directly involved with the WEF's Great Reset plans. As I noted in that aforementioned video, the tokenization of all real-world assets in such a manner means the government and central bank could turn off your ownership of anything at any given time for whatever reason it sees fit, including your identity. Then again, you're apparently going to own nothing, so... Now, as far as digitization goes, the elephant in the room is the digitization of money, specifically the development of a central bank digital currency, or CBDC, which is something that just about every central bank is planning on rolling out, courtesy of the BIS. Now, if you watched our video about cryptocurrency versus CBDCs, you'll know that the two couldn't be any more different. While cryptocurrencies are built from the ground up to maximize freedom, CBDCs are built from the ground up to maximize control. Where, when, and how you spend, even how much you save. If you watched our video about the WEF's massive crypto report, however, you'll know that a few crypto projects seem to have sided with the WEF as well, and that the WEF sees the appeal of a so-called synthetic CBDC, which involves using a centralized stablecoin like Circle's USDC as a de facto CBDC. For what it's worth, it's unlikely that centralized stablecoin issuers like Circle will force KYC on wallets holding USDC anytime soon, as CEO Jeremy Allaire has made it clear that the company wants to make its stablecoin as cash-like as possible. This makes sense given that USDC does in fact seem to be becoming a de facto digital dollar, and it's in the interest of the United States that this digital currency finds its way into as many digital wallets as possible. This can only be done by relaxing KYC and AML. In any case, there's just one missing piece of the CBDC puzzle, and that's a dystopian digital identity. This is a prerequisite for the rollout of a CBDC, since you need to be able to identify individuals. And let's just say that governments have been working hard on proof of concepts for digital IDs during the pandemic. A digital ID is also a prerequisite for widespread internet censorship, which the WEF apparently wants to implement with the help of artificial intelligence. I suppose that's not surprising, given that information about the WEF and its affiliates is spreading like wildfire these days. To be blunt, resisting the WEF's digitization is going to be extremely difficult, and of the 5 focuses of the Great Reset, it's by far the most important pillar. That's because if you control the flow of information and the flow of money, you truly control everything. Case in point, Klaus explicitly stated in that Great Reset virtual event that they need digital infrastructure such as digital identity, facial recognition, human tracking, etc., to enforce ESG criteria and all the upcoming social contracts the WEF priests are cooking up in the organization's ivory tower. That means that it is imperative that you reject any form of digital identity that is not completely decentralized from top to bottom. And if you don't know what that means, I'll leave a link in the description for you. It also means that you need to get your hands on some form of currency that cannot be easily tracked, censored, or confiscated by a centralized authority. This includes cash, precious metals, and select cryptocurrencies. I seriously cannot stress how important this is, because CBDCs are coming. However, I must caution that cryptocurrencies with publicly viewable blockchains like BTC may not be ideal, as these transactions will be easily tracked. That's why a privacy coin like XMR might be a better option, but it'll really depend on what the unique circumstances you're dealing with are. Finally, familiarize yourself with decentralized video platforms like Odyssey, learn how to use decentralized live streaming platforms like Theta, and start uploading information you think is at risk of censorship to decentralized storage solutions like Arweave. These cryptos will be extremely important. Make no mistake, the freedom of information and the freedom of money are the ultimate deterrents to the Great Reset. That's because the truth eventually overcomes indoctrination, no matter how many times it's labeled disinformation or misinformation. And overcoming this depends on the ability to financially support the individuals and institutions speaking and propagating these truths. Pro tip: keep physical copies of all your most important records, such as land deeds, home ownership documents, passports, driver's licenses, crypto wallet seeds, and the like, even if they're expired. They will help preserve your identity if you're unpersoned for opposing the WEF's ever-expanding agendas. And if you think that compliance will save you, recent events have shown that it will only make things worse for you and everyone else in the end. The only winners in this system will be stakeholders at the WEF, which ties into the 4th factor of the Great Reset, and that's the introduction of stakeholder capitalism. Now, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how the WEF will introduce stakeholder capitalism, mainly because it's not entirely clear how the stakeholder capitalism governance structure works. The WEF has over 4,000 individual members and has hundreds of institutional partners, 100 of which are labelled as strategic, i.e. important. How they all come to a consensus is anyone's guess. Even if we assume it's just the 100 strategic partners calling the shots, it's hard to imagine that they're all on the same page about every issue. In fact, I remember watching one of Klaus's speeches from one of the WEF's events earlier in the pandemic, and it sounded like he was desperate to keep the interests of these so-called stakeholders aligned. Now, you'd think the real stakeholders are governments, but Great Reset co-author Thierry Malloret admitted at that virtual event that the private sector effectively controls the public sector through lobbying. If you watched our video about the enemies of cryptocurrency, you'll know that Wall Street is one of the biggest lobbyists out there. This means that the real stakeholders are the big banks, asset managers, and the central banks, as they ultimately determine how money moves in the economy. On paper, central banks are supposed to be apolitical, meaning they don't espouse any particular ideology. In practice, this isn't always the case, and in places like Europe, the central bank has been explicit about supporting the same agendas as the WEF. As for the big banks, they seem to be on the same page as the asset managers, which makes sense given that most of them are on the same street, Wall Street. The biggest names on this block are BlackRock and Bank of America, both of which have been explicit in their intentions to direct capital to anyone or anything that's bowing at the altar of ESG, and removing capital from anyone or anything that offends their sensibilities, regardless of ESG status, such as Tesla. This relates to how stakeholder capitalism can be fought, and that's to exacerbate the differences in interests between the different stakeholders at the WEF wherever possible. To be frank, this is probably not something most of us can do, as we probably don't have the ear of, say, the Central Bank of Bulgaria. In any case, it's important to point out that centralized power is inherently unstable. That's because as more power gathers in one place, the more profit someone stands to gain if they stab the other participants in the back, especially if it earns them the support of the people. Now, call me crazy, but I think elite figures like Elon Musk fall into this category. It's not so much that he's some benevolent fellow, it's that he's run the numbers and realized that he stands to gain much more by siding with the crowd. Besides, he's already richer than all the other elite figures, so he's won their hierarchical game. Now, as stupid as it sounds, supporting breakaway figures like Elon might be our best bet at encouraging more of them to defect from the WEF and ruin its stakeholder capitalism. I imagine there's more than a few stakeholders who are sick of being hated by the public and can't stand Klaus and his clown company, and who would love to get the same sort of fanfare as the Doge Father. Pro tip, tell Elon I sent you. So this brings me to the final factor of the Great Reset, and that's the export of the WEF's endgame to every single corner of the Earth. As I mentioned earlier, Klaus explicitly stated during that virtual conference that the WEF will leverage its network of global shapers and young global leaders to ensure the Great Reset is implemented in every country. Klaus also specified that there are over 10,000 of these usurpers slowly slipping into various positions of power around the world, and he repeatedly stated that the Great Reset's success depends on this. This makes sense because there's only so much the WEF can achieve from the top down. The pandemic proved this for reasons I won't get into here, but the TLDR is that Klaus and his cult followers saw the pandemic response as a, quote, test of the Great Reset philosophy. Well, this top-down test didn't go nearly as well as the WEF had hoped, which seems to be why the WEF has been leaning so heavily on those global shapers and young global leaders as of late. It's an inorganic, bottom-up approach that pushes the WEF's agenda in major social and economic hubs, and it's no coincidence that most of them seem to have been onboarded during the pandemic. Now, what's awesome is that the global shapers and young global leaders' websites are searchable. The former lets you see which WEF folks are looking to change things in your city, and the latter lets you see which WEF folks are looking to change things in your country or region. If you see that a global shaper or young global leader is running for public office, vote for a different candidate who represents your views but isn't aligned with the WEF. All it takes to double-check is a quick search on the WEF's website, the Global Shapers website and the Global Leaders website. Funnily enough, someone I know was blocked by the WEF on Twitter for commenting on just 2 posts saying to vote against its young global leaders. Note that the WEF gets lots of hate on Twitter every day and doesn't block everyone. This leads me to believe that subverting the WEF's subverters is the organization's Achilles heel, and I suppose we're going to find out once the word gets out. Klaus admitted at the end of that virtual event that they might not succeed, so let's ensure they don't. Remember that we only have until 2030, so make the next 8 years count through your selective spending, full attention, directed energy, and informed voting. That's really all you need to do to defeat the WEF at the end of the day. All the other stuff is just to be extra safe if things go south. Once the WEF has been defeated, the next order of business will be to create robust, decentralized autonomous organizations to replace institutions like the WEF and its affiliates to prevent this degree of centralized power from ever happening again, so that the average person can finally live in peace. That and fixing the money, which has arguably been the driver of this centralization since the dawn of time. You can learn more about the power of crypto governance using the link in the description. That's all for today's video about how to resist the Great Reset.